One of the points that I wanted to get across here is how the Aruch HaShulchan compares with the Mishnah Brura. So I wanted to go over the same set of halachas that we did in the Mishnah Brura. I want to see them in the Aruch HaShulchan.
I know that when we've done the Aruch HaShulchan in the past, I always get this impression he has a bit of a personality, I guess you'd say. I don't know how you'd say it. He seems to be a little, I don't know. I'm always struck by his language.
So that's interesting. I think I know what you mean, but can you explain that further? I think that's
it seems to me that he's not so dispassionate. You may, I don't know the Halakhic literature that much, but it just seems to me when we look at it, he's a little bit more. Maybe it's the things we look at. I don't know. He seems to be a little bit more. I don't know. Not controversial is not the right word, but a little more passionate, maybe.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think he lets some of his personality come. It's a very interesting observation. I think he lets some of it more of his personality. Look, when you learn the Rambam, you learn the Mishnah Torah, on rare occasions, but it does happen, the Rambam will introduce a halacha by saying Yir'eli, right? Which would, like, usually we say Nir'eli, but his language I think is Yir'eli. And then he gives his personal opinion. It's extremely rare because the Rambam really was relying on earlier sources. But occasionally, he speaks, as it were, in his own voice. You also see it in the Rif. The Rif, like, I don't know the percentages, but, more than 90, probably 95% of the Rif is just the language of the Gemara. It's just, we've seen the Rif. But once in a while, he'll speak in his own voice, and he'll, usually when he's arguing with the name that preceded him, he'll speak in his own voice. So I do think it's an interesting point, and you get a feel for it's in one of the parts of the Aruch HaShulchan which I didn't do for class because I felt it was a little too technical without going through a lot more sources. He refers to, I think, here, Paul King. He refers to his comments in Yoredea about the size of about shiurim for achila. Oh, and here's Michael Wynn. Okay. I'll finish this thought. I'll let Michael connect, and then we'll begin. Hi. I'm in the middle of a quick thought because of something Michael Schwartz noted about the Aruch HaShulchan that I'll put it in my words. Michael Schwartz's words were that sometimes we see some of the personality of the Aruch HaShulchan, and we see that he's, let's say, not dispassionate and maybe even passionate, if I can paraphrase a little bit of what you said. And I said, yes, I think this is true. And I was just noting one of the issues that we're discussing in this siman of the Shulchan Aruch is about shiurim, and how in Yom Kippur the shiurim, how we don't combine the shiur of eating and the shiur of drinking, for example. And at some point here, he's going to refer us to a discussion about shiurim and isurei shiurim elsewhere in his in the Aruch HaShulchan on Yoredea. And so I went through that, and it's actually in the Shulchan Aruch. It's a very short siman. It has to do with the laws of insects, eating and not eating insects. And but then he has a very long discussion where he goes through numerous sources throughout Shas and Yerushalmi and Mishnah and all kinds of places. And he says, I have a lot of questions. And he lays out all these questions about seeming contradictions or things that don't seem to fit quite right into some of the things we were discussing. Well, not so much here in Yoma, but in other places. And one of the things I think that you see from the Aruch HaShulchan is he was a posek's posek, and what I mean by that is that there is a tendency, and especially I would say in our days, for poskim to hedge their bets, and generally that means l'chumra, like they'll examine different opinions, and then they'll say in so many words, like to be on the safe side, we should be machmir. So the Aruch HaShulchan is famous for not being that way, that he really examines the din in depth and comes to his own conclusions, and sometimes he agrees with other achronim, sometimes he disagrees. And then here, like that example that I'm alluding to, he goes into great depth to try to, understand and put things together, and he lays out his thought process for you. Now, what we saw in the Mishnah Berurah, the style of the Mishnah Berurah is similar to the style of the Nosei Kelim, the other Meforshim on the Shulchan Aruch that preceded him. And what that means is that if you think, you can think about it this way. In a way, the Mishnah Berurah fulfilled a role that was similar to Yosef Karo when he wrote the Beit Yosef, right? So when Yosef Karo wrote the Beit Yosef, he looked at the Tur, which was by his time was already a popular Sefer Halacha, and he also said that the Tur did a lot of the groundwork for what he wanted to do. And what did he want to do? He wanted to make more or less a compendium of sources about any given halacha, and then to decide, and he has his own way of deciding. So there are a lot of differences between the Mishnah Berurah and the Beis Yosef. I want to make that clear. But one of the things that's similar is that they both see themselves at a point in history where there are many sifrei halacha, and they want to make some order. They want to put things in order because it's very hard for an average person to figure out on their own what the halacha should be. So if you look, if you look at a standard Shulchan Aruch, it has, by the time of the Mishnah Berurah, there are literally dozens of commentators on the Shulchan Aruch, and of course the commentators on the Shulchan Aruch are people who are introducing their own halachic opinions, which is often at odds with the Shulchan Aruch. So how do you know who to go by? And then on top of that, there are many other Sfarim that are not printed right next to the Shulchan Aruch, and they were, by the time of the Mishnah Berurah, there were thousands of tshuvot that were already published that have to do with these things. So how does an average person know the best way to go? So he also said, I'm going to look at all of this literature that's been published since the Shulchan Aruch, and I'm going to put it in order and make a Mishnah Berurah, right? Make a clear way of learning. And in that sense, it's similar to what the Beis Yosef did, but it's also, it's dissimilar in other ways, and we don't have to go into all the other ways. One of the other things I'll point out about the Mishnah Berurah, you see what he does is, first of all, he does write a very clear commentary. I mean, I hope you have a taste of it, and appreciate it. But when you learn halachic literature, you do appreciate how clearly he wrote, and concisely, even though it seems like a very long commentary, but he wrote very clearly and very concisely, and he separated off his his deeper insights. He separated that off into the Be'or Halacha, and so you don't have to mix them all up. And what you also see is that he's relying very heavily on these acronym that preceded him to determine halacha, and I have to word this very carefully. He introduces he kind of introduces certain ideas which were not necessary, despite the fact that they were written in previous acronym, were not necessarily widespread custom. And there's a famous essay, it's quite a long essay, it was written by Rabbi Professor Chaim Soloveitchik, where he discusses some of these aspects of the Mishnah Berurah, because he puts it into a context that he noticed in his own lifetime. It's that there was a shift in his lifetime from what he calls the mimetic tradition, right? The mimetic tradition, meaning like when you mime, you're imitating what came before. And what he means is that you grew up in a frum home and you knew what to do. And he contrasts that with the approach of the Mishnah Berurah. He's not the only example, but it's an important example that the Mishnah Berurah seems to shift away to some degree from this mimetic tradition to introduce halachot that in fact were not widespread, even though they were brought down by eminent poskim before him, but they were not widespread minhag. Interestingly, one of those, one example of that, I believe, I haven't read that essay in a long time, and I think though he may use this as an example. It's a famous example. It has to do with Pesach, and that's shiurim on Leil HaSeder. So we're talking about shiurim of what you're not allowed to eat on Yom Kippur. I just said to Michael Schwartzberg, before everyone came, I wanted to do something for Pesach. So here's a little something for Pesach. In my lifetime, which is, more or less in your lifetimes, there has been a shift from people when they want to eat a kazayas of matzah on Leil HaSeder, a kazayas of maror. People we're not, like when I was growing up, we didn't really measure these out. We just knew that we were supposed to eat, a certain amount. But within my lifetime, it's become extremely popular to use very strict shiurim. And like I've even seen printed out, like if you're using a square matzah, you can get like a printout, right, that shows you this much or this much, and this is this opinion and this is this opinion, and all of that. And
you can weigh them.
Weighing is not always the best way to do it. But for example, with matzah, there are two issues. So let's say with matzah, if you wanted to weigh it, what you would have to do is crush it, because you don't want to weigh the air pockets, right? So you have to crush it, and then you have to weigh it if you want to be exact. And the same thing for, let's say, maror, right? So if you're using romaine lettuce, which is the ideal, how do you measure that? You'd have to well, in theory, maybe actually you wouldn't. I understand what you're saying, but nonetheless, one of the reasons this became a big issue And this is just an interesting thing that because there are different opinions about shiurim, and I've shown you on the charts. There's a very wide difference of opinion about shiurim, and according to some opinions, you know what? Since we're doing this, we'll take a little time and do it. Just a second, and I want to, and I'll explain how this is related to my, to what I'm talking about. It's funny because I just closed these, but it's okay. We'll open them again. Here, midot hanefach, shirei midot hashetach. Having trouble seeing this. Just a second. Here we go. All right. Does everybody see this chart?
It looks something modern.
Yeah, this is a modern chart. This is this is one of the features. You can find these kinds of charts online. This is in the Bar Ilan program. But here, let's say on Leil HaSeder, you have to drink 4 cups of wine. Ideally, you drink a revi'it. It's enough to drink Melo Lugmav, right? That's a shir also for Leil HaSeder. But ideally, you drink a revi'it. So how much is a revi'it? So either it's 70, it's as low as 76.4 samak, right? Like basically milliliters, and as high as, according to Chassam Sofer, 212. That's almost 3 times as much. So how did it come about that there was such a huge difference of opinion? See, if you look at the first couple, so this is Midot V'Shirei Torah B'dat HaRambam. I'm not sure exactly what the source for this is, but in the sense that you can determine this from the Rambam. The Rambam goes into a lot of detail on shiurim, and basically you can determine all the shiurei nefach, all the volumetric shiurim, based on the size of an average barley corn, right? Seorah. That's what they're based on. That's what it boils down to. And based on that, you could actually determine all the rest of the shiurim. There's a sugya in Masechet Psachim that also makes certain, that's ekroni to this, and so forth. You can put it together. The Rambam talks about it. In modern times, in very modern times, in the 20th century, we had Rav Naeh, who I believe was Lubavitch. I didn't know that at the time, but I believe he was Lubavitch. He was also a posek, who's a major posek, and he did a lot of his own research on this, and he came up with these shiurim. So he says close to what we would determine, let's say, from the Rambam, 86.5. And then famously we have the Chazon Ish, right? So we hear about this, like the shir of the Chazon Ish, which is always bigger. Now, why is that? How did that happen? So here in the list here, one of the other people in the list, so we have the Igros Moshe, that's Moshe Feinstein. We have the Tzlach, the Tziyun Nefesh Chaya, which was written by Rav Yehuda Landau in the late 18th century. He was Rav in Prague in the late 18th century. He's known both for his Chidushim on Shas, which is, he called it Tzlach. That's what we call it, the Tzlach. He called it the Tziyun Nefesh Chaya. And then he's also very well known for his Tshuvot, which are called the Nodab Yehuda, or the Nodab Yehuda in Yeshivish. And the Tzlach in the late 18th century, along with other poskim of the time, there was kind of a zeitgeist, because we also have Rav Yom Tov Lippman Heller, who's the author of the Tosfos Yom Tov, Perush on the Mishnah, and others who re-examined shiurim. And we could spend a lot of time in this. I'm not going to do it today, but they were puzzled based on the size of eggs and the size of olives that they were confronting, that they thought that actually maybe shiurim had shifted in size. And I'm oversimplifying, but that's basically their concern. And so they did a lot of their iyun. And in the end, they came up with much larger shiurim. Now, a large shiur is both the chumrah and the kula, depending on what the circumstances. So, for example, on Yom Kippur, if you say a kazayis, here, 1 second. Well, let's say a reviz. Okay, so we just learned that drinking on Yom Kippur is asur, right? You're not allowed to drink below lugmav. We said that that's a little bit less than a reviz in an average sized person. So actually, that might not be a good example because that's one of the only shiurim where we explicitly go by each person. But in terms of the kazayis, let's say if the difference between a kazayis is, let's say, 1 unit as opposed to 3 units, right? Whatever those, right? Because we have like here a difference of 3 from the smallest unit to the largest unit. Let's say that a kazayis, if you say the kazayis is very large, so yes, that means you have to eat more matzah on Leil HaSeder. But it would also indicate, so if a kazayis is very large, then also a kakosepes is very large. So that means that a chatzi shir, less than a shir on Yom Kippur, could still be relatively large compared to, let's say, by the Chasam Sofer or by the Chazon Ish, it could be a relatively large amount that you coch eat. Whereas by Rav Chaim Naeh, you would already be over on the diaraisa of eating, right? Because he holds a much smaller shiur, if you see what I mean. So in other words, a shiur, the fact that it's large, or the fact that it's small relative to other opinions, it always can have implications that are both l'chumra and l'kula. It just depends on the circumstance. If you say that a shiur is, if it's a large kikosebes agasa, then you could eat what Reb Chaim Naeh holds, or Reb Chaim Naeh might hold that a kikosebes agasa is half the shiur of the Chazon Ish. So if you ate the shiur of Reb Chaim Naeh, according to the Chazon Ish, you still wouldn't be chayiv kares on Yom Kippur for that shiur, if you see what I'm saying. So I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here. This is one of the things that came out of the derech of the Mishnah Brura, introduced in many areas, at least in some areas, many areas of halacha. He introduced halachot that were theoretically already paskined by earlier poskim, but hadn't really been widely accepted. And I can give you examples from Sofros, which get a little technical, so I'm not going to do it right now. But there's at least a couple I can think of right offhand, where based on the Mishnah Brura, we write. I mean, actually, I don't entirely do it, but most Sofrim write letters differently than they did in Europe because of the Mishnah Brura. Because the Mishnah Brura said, really, we should do this instead of this. And it's not that he pulled it out of his hat. There were definitely sources for it, but some of the things he introduces, nobody wrote that way before the Mishnah Brura laid this out. And I say nobody, as far as I know. I mean, I've looked at hundreds of Sifrei Torah, probably more, from Europe, from all over Europe, and I never saw anybody who put the tag at the end of certain letters where the Mishnah Brura says you're supposed to put them. And it's a fascinating thing. So the Mishnah Brura, in that sense, was not afraid to paskin things that really challenged minhag. Whereas in general, the Aruch HaShulchan went in what was essentially a more traditional way, which is to try to uphold minhag whenever possible. So that's one of the things that you'll see that's different. But the other thing that we're going to see right now as we go into the Aruch HaShulchan, and yes, we've done some Aruch HaShulchan in the past, but let's take a look at what we're doing now. You'll see that his whole approach to understanding, to laying out halacha is very different than the Mishnah Brura. Now, the Mishnah Brura, as we saw, he will give sometimes little introductory remarks to put things into perspective, but he sees himself as writing glosses on the Shulchan Aruch. So you have to read the Shulchan Aruch, and then you have to read his comments. And that's very clear. It's a very clear distinction. The Aruch HaShulchan, who is always going to be basing himself on, he's starting from the Shulchan Aruch and any given siman, but we'll see that he goes through in a wider sense and gives more explanation. And in this sense, he's much more like the Rambam. Right, so when you learn the Rambam, you know that in the beginning, first of all, the beginning of any set of halachot, he'll tell you what mitzvot are going to be defined in the following halachot, and he'll mention the mitzvot from the Torah, and then at the beginning of every set of halachot, he will introduce you into that set of halachot step by step, and so you get a very good context. It's one of the most outstanding aspects of the Mishnah Torah is that it's not just a sefer halacha as such; it's a sefer halacha that gives you conceptual basis and the whole context for understanding halacha. And in that sense, the Aruch HaShulchan was doing something similar, and he wasn't the first one to do it, but he developed his own unique style. So without further ado, and as I told Michael Schwartz, I'm going to finish a little bit early today.
Just to interrupt here, would you say that in the case of Aruch HaShulchan, as it is for Rambam, that sort of this conceptual understanding is an end in itself and maybe even the primary end in itself, as opposed to halacha l'maaseh?
No. I would say both for the Rambam and for the Aruch HaShulchan, the primary goal is clearly to give you psak halacha. That's the primary goal. But I think both for the Rambam and for the Aruch HaShulchan, I think it's very clear that they felt that in order to follow halacha properly, you need to understand it. You need to understand it based on its moorings and its sources. The Mishnah Brura also felt that, but it was not as high a priority for him to place it in that kind of context. So
I can ask something?
Sure.
Yes. When you say you need to understand, do you mean you need to understand how to fulfill the mitzvah, or you need to know the arguments for such a psika or another psika, the arguments which made the author decide for some psika, not for another?
So in the case of the Aruch HaShulchan, that both of those things are true. In the case of the Rambam, the first thing is true. The Rambam does not bring machloket as a rule in Mishnah Torah. Occasionally, he will bring more than one opinion, but it's very rare. It's very, very rare that he'll bring more than one opinion. And that was the whole point for him to write the Mishnah Torah, is to have one psak din, right, for everything. But it was important, it's clear to me that, when you learn the Rambam, he wants you to understand the basis of what you're doing for every step that you're doing, and the logic of everything that you're doing within the rubric that he lays out for you. So the Aruch HaShulchan wants you to know that, and by laying, so the Aruch HaShulchan is also fulfilling a similar goal that the Mishnah Berurah had, which was to go through the literature of the previous few hundred years since the Shulchan Aruch, and to lay it out in a clear way where you can get one psak. But whereas the Mishnah Berurah is doing it in a kind of, he's presenting us the halachot in a sense in a more limited way, in other words, with less conceptual basis. And the Aruch HaShulchan is going to give us a whole conceptual framework for any set of halachot that we go through, and he will bring sometimes the controversies that preceded him, and then say that he'll rule like one as opposed to another. And the Mishnah Berurah does that less. When the Mishnah Berurah does things like that, he does it on the side, sometimes in the Be'ur Halacha, where that's where he'll get into specific controversies, more than in the Mishnah Berurah itself. Whereas the Aruch HaShulchan incorporates all of this into his text. So the Aruch HaShulchan, as we'll see, you can't pick it up and look for a halacha the same way you can in a Mishnah Berurah. So there's a certain practical advantage to the Mishnah Berurah. Like you want to know a specific halacha, so you find the siman in the Shulchan Aruch, and then you can find the seif in the Shulchan Aruch that talks about what you want, and then you can see what the Mishnah Berurah had to say about that. And even, I mean, I don't have this now, but I've seen that people have already published indices for the Mishnah Berurah. So if you're not sure where it is, and you don't know exactly how to find things in the Shulchan Aruch, you can look at an index. It'll take you right to a psak din in the Mishnah Berurah. The Aruch HaShulchan, in order to understand his piskei dinim, to give him his due, you really have to go through the whole thing. It's very hard to skip to a specific place, because his simanim, the way that simanim are numbered, this is going to talk about all the same halachot as that siman in the Shulchan Aruch, right? So siman tafresh yud bet, which we're going to look at in the Orach Chaim, that's going to go through all the halachot that we saw in the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Berurah. But the seifim are his own seifim, because he goes at his own pace, and they don't parallel seif aleph bet gimel that in the Shulchan Aruch. There was one other thing I wanted to tell you by way of introduction, and I can't remember it now, but it'll probably come to me as we go. So let's do a little bit of the Aruch HaShulchan, and we'll see how it goes. So Seif Aleph, Afal Gab de B'chol HaTorah Kula, Hava Achila B'Kezayit, right? So even throughout the entire Torah, Achila, in other words, the definition of eating, what we consider to be eating, the minimal amount of eating, is Kezayit. We measure it by the size of an olive. Mikol makom, nonetheless, b'Yom Kippurim ba'aha kabbalah da'ashiurhu kechot tevet. Right? We have it by way of tradition on Yom Kippur. The shir of eating is the size of a date. V'hu ma'at pachot mikabetza. It's a little bit less than a kabetza. The ta'amol shel davar. The reason for this is lefi shebiyom Kippurim lo k'tiva lashon achila. On Yom Kippur, right, the Torah doesn't tell us not to eat. It doesn't use the language of achila. Ella, it says, Kikol hanefesh asher lo tzu'uneh. Any person who doesn't afflict themselves. Klamar kishuhu ra'ev tityashev da'ato alav. What does it mean to be afflicted? That means that if he would eat, when he's hungry, it would put his mind at ease. So it's come in tradition from Moshe Sinai. Right? It's the size of a fat date. This is the shiur for all people. right? Whether it's a dwarf or whether it's Og Melech HaBashan, who was a giant. Uvein b'machalim pshutim, whether it's just plain food. Uvein b'machalim shmeinim, fat or fatty food. Ella dehanana. So he's preempting the question. If that's true, and in other words, if it's true that the Torah is concerned that you shouldn't eat so much that you mityashev b'dat, so how could it be that there's one shiur for everybody, right? Because we know that relatively speaking, people are going to, get full, as it were, based on different amounts of food. So right? The only difference is that for the small person, he will be well put at ease when he eats this shiur, and Og Melech HaBashan, he would be put at ease somewhat, right? But it would be like enough. Very fatty foods, mityashev dato b'shiur hazeh. And even, in other words, because he recognizes there's a difference between eating, maybe a cracker and a piece of fatty meat, even if it's the same amount, right? Your body reacts to that differently. He says, but nonetheless, whatever it is that you're eating, if you eat that shiur, that we have the Kabbalah, that shiur b'shiur zeh you mityashev dat. And things that are not fatty, there's plain things that are not fatty, so you'll have yishuv dat a little bit less. So this, and he gives us the reference, right? This is the Gemara, which we've already referenced, right, from the Shulchan Aruch, from the Mishnah Berurah, that he tells us this is a Gemara in Yoma on Pei Amud Bet, which we haven't gotten to. I now remember the other thing I want to tell you. There's one other thing that's interesting to note about the difference between the Mishnah Berurah and the Aruch HaShulchan, which I found out. I found out most of these things when I was in yeshiva, but when I was in yeshiva, and still now, and I recommend this to everybody. Whenever you start learning a sefer, if you can, read the introduction by the author. Introductions will give you insight into the person who wrote it and why they wrote it, what their aims are. It's a very interesting literary phenomenon because we don't have it throughout history. Like the Rif, we don't have an introduction to the Rif by the Rif. But not that long after, we have the Rambam, who's extensive introduction to the Mishnah Torah. He has a very long introduction to his Perush on the Mishnah, which is a very important work by itself. And basically, more or less from the time of the Mishnah Torah, most important works, or even maybe not, but most works, people did feel a need to write an introduction of one sort or another, and they're often very important as works by themselves, and even if they're not learned as works by themselves, but you can learn a lot from them. So you can read the Mishnah Berurah's Hakdama. It's in the beginning of the first chapter, and he has some other Hakdamot to different sets of halachot later. When I looked at the Aruch HaShulchan, I looked in the Orach Chaim, which is, the section of the Mishnah that the Mishnah Berurah covers. There's no Hakdama, and I was really surprised that there was no Hakdama, because this was a very common thing to write a Hakdama. It was only after doing some searching, I found that he wrote his Hakdama not on the Orach Chaim. He wrote his Hakdama on the Choshen HaMishpat. That is, so the section of the Shulchan Aruch that deals with what we consider to be civil law and court law, tort law. That's the Choshen HaMishpat. And it turns out that was where he began, right? So the Orach Chaim technically is the first section of the Shulchan Aruch. The Mishnah Berurah, clearly, he writes the Mishnah Berurah only on the Orach Chaim. He didn't write on all the Shulchan Aruch. because his aim was to make everyday halacha accessible to people who had, what would be considered at the time an average, like a very basic yeshiva background, right? Not necessarily the great Talmidei Chachamim in their time, not necessarily Rabbanim, but people who knew how to learn a good, a Daf Gemara, people who knew how to learn basic texts, they could go through his text and understand it. The Aruch HaShulchan, by contrast, his initial concern was the terrible state of rabbinic courts in his day and age. And he was the Rav based in Vardik in Russia. And I remember reading, and then I think this is just from the article that I read about him in the Encyclopedia Judaica, and I don't remember now exactly where, but he had been invited to head up the court there. I think he refused for a long time until finally they really persuaded him to come. And when he came, he was apparently not happy with the state of the court and the state of the judges on the court and their knowledge of Choshen Mishpat, right? Because that's what they need to know to be judges. And so that was the first thing that he wrote. So it also gives you some insight into where each of them started from. So the Aruch HaShulchan starts from the judges in his time. He wanted them to be brought up to speed. And he eventually gets around to doing all the rest of the Shulchan Aruch. And not only that, he writes the Aruch HaShulchan Ha'atid, which covers most of the halachot that are not in the Shulchan Aruch, but are from the Gemara and from poskim that you see in the Mishnah Torah. In other words, he was trying to follow in the footsteps of the Rambam, and he wrote halachot hatluyot ba'aretz and kodshim and taharot and all these things that weren't being, were not noheg in his time, except even within his time, the sections he was writing on halachot hatluyot ba'aretz were starting to be revived, right? Because he was living in a time when there were people who were moving to Israel, and he does become an important voice in some of those discussions. And we're waiting for the rest of them. But in any event, that's the other thing I wanted to tell you about the Aruch HaShulchan. I just think it's very important and very interesting contrast with the Mishnah Berurah. I don't know why that's okay. So it's Seif Bet. Right. So all kinds of food combine with each other to fill out the shiur. If you eat a little of this and a little of that, it combines to eat enough that you'll be chayav karet. If you ate a chatzi shiur, v'shatach chatzi shiur, and you drank a half of a shiur, and mitzdarfin, right? They don't combine. Lo miat v'da'ateh, because right, this will not be miyashev da. Amnam hamashkim aba'im lahachshir ha'ochel, the liquids that come to be machshir ochel, shehetov la'achila, things that you use to prepare food. Now, I'm going to tell you that this concept of hakshirat ha'ochel, this is a term that we see in other parts of halacha that we don't think about so much, that have to do with taharot. But you might know that there's a concept in Tuma that food isn't mikabel Tuma unless it has liquid that came in contact with it. We learn it out from the Torah, and then a lot of gzeirot to Rabbanan that have to do with that. Here, when he's using the term lahachshir ha'ochel sheyeh tov la'achila, he's pointing out that he's using the term lahachshir ha'ochel to prepare the food, just like in a normal sense, the way we prepare food, to make it good for eating. So, kamo yerek im hatzir shelo, basar im melach, right? So he's pointing out these are things. He's not using it in the sense of Tuma and Tahara. He's using it in the sense of These are things that we add to foods because right? It's something we already touched on, that he's explaining a little bit more. Right. So when you prepare a vegetable, maybe you'll prepare it with some kind of brine, or when you prepare meat, you're going to add salt. Afil namex, even if it melted, even if the salt melted, or it's dissolved, and it became like liquid, right? It became like water. Mitztarfin, to kolach shure uchla ochel. Anything that's there to prepare the food, to make it fit for eating, has the din of the ochel itself, meaning, right, that even though we don't eat salt by itself and we don't drink brine by itself, but when you eat them in context of the food that they're used for preparation, then that does become part of the shiur. Right? Also, if you were to fry meat in oil, anything like that, meat starfin, right? So the oil that you're using, if you're eating the oil, that's also part of it. In hayabo kashiur, if it had a shiur, what if you had a shiur? Let's say you cooked up a piece of meat. It was exactly kekotevet hagasa, or maybe a little bit more. All right, but then you let it dry out. All right, let's say you put it out in the sun, you let it dry out in the sun, it's tamek b'chama or ba'ur, or you put it next to something hot and it dried out. The nifchat me hashiur, and then the shiur was less. So you started off with a piece of meat, let's say, that was a certain size, and then it started to dry, it dried out. I think I'm losing Paul and Michael again. Right? Or the other way. Let's say you had, you can imagine this, let's say with like a carrot, right? What do you do with a dry carrot? You might put it in water to make it, if it's dried out, you can put it in water, it'll expand, right? And it'll be more like it was when it was fresh. So the same thing, right? So what if you had a piece of food that was less than a shiur, but then you put it in a damp place, and then it grew to be a shiur. So which shiur do we go by? Hochin kashiur shel achshav. We go by the shiur of now. In other words, at the time you're eating it, what was the shiur? The din zebe'erno biyored deyasiman pehe. That's what I was referring to earlier. This is where he talks about this. B'chol ha'isurim. This is true for all isurim, right? Any isur, we go after the shiur at the time that you're eating it. We explained there that the food that's caught between your teeth is not part of the shiur. But what's between your chanichayim, which in this case means like between your, like the tongue and the palate, that is mitzdaref. And there are other dinim, ayin sham. He goes into a long discussion about this. This is very interesting, but we're not going to do it here. But he mentions it here because it's pertinent, right? So now, Sif Gimel, Ashur Zeh, Afim lo achalo ka'achat, ela b'hafsakot. Even this shiur, even if you didn't eat it all at once, you ate it intermittently. Shachal ma'at v'yifsik. You ate a little and you stopped. Until it worked itself up, right? You completed the shiur. Mitzdarfin, all the things that you ate, combined to make a shiur. This is true of anything that's forbidden to eat in the Torah. If you didn't wait from the beginning to the end, in other words, from the time you started eating to the time you finished eating, more than the time it takes to eat a pras, then what you ate is mitzaref, right? It combines to the shiur. Being shaha, and if you did wait longer than kedei achilat pras and mitzarfin, then what you ate in different times isn't mitzaref. So this is also true, by the way, for like when you have a meal. If you want, so here we're coming to Pesach. When you eat your matzah, right? However, whatever size you determine that you're supposed to be eating, you have to eat it b'chdei achilat pras. You can't just take a bite and rely on the fact that you'll have more matzah later on in the meal. You have to eat, in order to be yotze, you have to eat a kazayis b'chdei achilas pras. I would advise everybody to not be too machmir about how long achilat pras is. So here, this is a case on Pesach. If you say that kedei achilat pras is a small amount of time, and he'll talk about how long it is in a moment. I alluded to this in a previous shiur, that when you talk about kedei achilat pras as a shiur, so we saw, and he's going to discuss this in a moment. There's a machloket rishonim about how much that is. Is it the equivalent of eating 3 beitzim or 4 beitzim? Right. So of course that's a substantial difference in time. How long it takes you to eat 3 eggs worth of food and 4 eggs worth of food. And so different, when we come to achronim, different achronim have different estimates of how long it is based on different opinions of whether it's which day you go after. But let's say on the very low end, some people say as little as 3 minutes, and on the high end, some people say as high as 9 or 10 minutes. So now on Yom Kippur, the chumrah is going to be if you go after the longer amount of time. If kedei achilat pras is, let's say, 9 minutes, so we're machmir to say that if you ate a shiur of kotevet hakasa over a period of 9 minutes, then you'll be that's asur. But what do we say on Pesach? So if you want to be machmir on Pesach, then you would go after the smaller shiur and say, I have to eat a kazayis of matzah in like 3 or 4 minutes. So that's what, it's just something to always bear in mind when you're talking about shiurim. Depending on the context, a big shiur or a small shiur could be a chumrah or it could be a kula. So here on Yom Kippur, the longer shiur is the chumrah. Okay. Back to the Aruch HaShulchan inside. This is Lach Mishmisinai. The Afalkav. The Bechol HaShiurin Habi Kazayit Shuhu Arbei Pachot Nika Kotev. And even though for all other shiurin in the Torah we go after a Kazayit, which is much less than a Kotev, and Mikol Makom Yinyan Hafsakot Shavin. In terms of eating intermittently, they're the same. Meaning we measure the length of time where the food combines based on kedei achilat pras. V'kim lahu dekishnim shach yoter mishiur pras ein miyashvin et hanefesh. And Chazal understood that if you waited so much time, more than kedei achilat pras, between your chatzi shiur here and your chatzi shiur there, that would not give you yishuv hadat. So now he's going to go into this in a little bit greater depth than what we saw in the Mishnah Brura. And he says, "V'shiur achilat pras, bein b'yom kippurim, bein b'chol ha'isurim, l'Rashi havi arba beitzim, l'Rambam shlosha beitzim." Right. So this is a machokus between Rashi and the Rambam. How much is an achilat pras? How much time is that? According to the Rambam, it's 3 beitzim, and it's based on how long it takes to eat 3 beitzim. And according to the Rashi, it's how long it takes to eat 4 beitzim. Beitzim sochakot, klomar b'milui uvurevach. Right. So I think I talked a little bit about this. There's this concept in shiurim that there's there's a shiur that could be b'tzimtzum or sochek or socheket, right there, where it expands out. This is true also for shiurim of length, and it's true for volumetric shiurim. And they say beitzim sochakot, klomar. This is what it means, beitzim sochakot. I think of it in English as like we say there's some play there, right? Because it reminds me of the word, I tried to figure this out exactly how it comes to that, but it could be it's actually the same idea. There's some play, right, when we say that there's between this shiur and that shiur. Komar b'milui v'reva. So we talk about the beitzim that we would measure this time frame based on how long it takes to eat beitzim. So we're talking about beitzim sochakot, klamar b'milui v'reva, right? They're full and big eggs, or reva, right? Where they're expanded, but a little bit tzimtzum, not a narrow interpretation. U'inyan halacha, right? So in halacha, b'shel Torah halech achar machmir, b'shel sofrim achar mekil. Right. So this is, we learn from Chazal, and it's interesting. I was just doing this in a different shiur. The Rambam uses this lashon in Hilchot Mamrim, where he talks about the difference between halachot d'oraita and halachot d'Rabbanan. So if you're talking about Torah law, you go after the machmir, and by d'Rabbanan you go after the mekil. I'll talk about that in a second. I just want to finish to the end of the halacha. Da shiurim einam ela l'karet v'korban. These shiurim are only to determine if you're chayav karet or if you would have to have brought a korban. Aval yisur ba'alma asur min haTorah. Afilu b'chol shehu. Right? That actually, right, and this is what we learned based on the Gemara, that the stam, the isur, is from even the smallest amount. So these shiurim are only relevant in principle to know what kind of punishment you would get. But actually, you're not allowed to even the smallest amount. The chatzi shiur asur min haTorah, ben b'yom kippurim, ben b'sharei isuri. Right, and that's what we saw from the Gemara. You might ask a question, not just here, but in general. You're probably familiar with this idea that we say that Safek d'oraita is l'chumran, Safek d'Rabbanan is l'kula. But you might ask, why is that? What's the conceptual basis for saying just because something is d'Rabbanan that it should be l'kula? And before we go further, let's consider something that we learned previously, which is that we learned that every halacha d'Rabbanan, why do we follow any halacha d'Rabbanan? Because there's a mitzvah d'oraita to follow the Rabbanan. Right? We've talked about this before, and it's in the sugya on Chanukah, where the Gemara asks the question, what bracha do you say on lighting candles? And it says, and then the Gemara says, Heichan Sivana, where were we commanded? Where were we commanded? Where does the Torah ever tell us to light Hanukkah candles that we should say, so the Gemara says we learned it from Lo Tasur. There's actually another daya that says we learned it from Shalavicha V'Yagetcha, but the Rambam and most Rishonim say we learn it from Lo Tasur. Right? The Torah says you're not allowed to deviate from what I tell you, neither right nor left, and that's in the context of rulings that you'll get from judges at any given time. So the Torah tells you have to not deviate from rulings of judges. So that covers the mitzvot d'Rabbanan. So now we know, all right? We talked about, I remember now, we talked about this at the beginning of the sugya. We had a whole thing about that. It had to do with the machloka between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about Chatzi Shir, because Reish Lakish held Chatzi Shir is asur d'Rabbanan. Anyway, you can revisit that. So now I can ask you the question. So any Isur D'Oraita, any Isur D'Rabanan that you violate, you're automatically violating an Isur D'Oraita. So why should it be that a Safek D'Rabanan is L'kul and a Safek D'Oraita is L'chumra?
Well, since my specialty seems to be going out on limbs.
Yeah, so go for it.
It seems to me that with certainly many halachot, where there's a measure involved, there certainly I know we don't do Pesach based on midrash, but for many of these measures, there's actually midrash that God actually showed Moshe Sinai actually a model of whatever determined the unit.
Okay.
So for example, the Chetzi shekel.
Okay.
Or the new moon.
So
even maybe so. What this suggests is that, for the halachot d'oraita, we can assume that there was that Moshe was actually shown the physical measure.
Okay.
Whereas, the Rabbanan, it's sort of derived after the fact, and so we can't be so there. We don't. There is not that physical model. How's that going out on a limb?
That's first of all, I admire you for going out on a limb. It's not easy to do that, or maybe it's easy for you. It's not easy for me. But
it's all the time they spend taking care of cats. What can I say? It's easily up but not easily down. So now I've got to call the fire brigade and get me down.
Okay. No, so I would say no. In other words, the suggestion is that maybe things or maybe there's some aspect of safek when it comes to any Rabbanan, but that's not really the point, because when the Rabbanan fixed whatever halachot they did, they were fixed, right? And we know it wasn't really based on the safek. The answer is more like this. The answer is more that Chazal, when they made their halachot, when they legislated or promulgated their laws, they included in the law this aspect that if there's a safek about the application of their law, included in that law is that you should be mekil. Okay, so what
So is that explicit or is it implicit? Do we
we learned that from the Gemara and the Rambam, and other people make that more explicit. But what I wanted, wait 1 second, I lost my train of thought for a second. No, but it makes sense in this regard, because a lot of there are different types of dinim de Rabbanan. So we have gzeirot, and we have takanot, and we have what the Rambam calls minhagot or minhag. But let's say gzeirot. Think of those, generally speaking, those are like mitzvot lo taseh, right? You don't do something, and we know that that's to make a siag l'Torah, right? To make a fence around the Torah. So what's the point? If we say that the fence around the Torah that we're making, in other words, we're giving a gader in order not to violate the Torah law. So it makes sense to say that if you're besafek about whether or not you're violating the Rabbanan law, that the Rabbanan would be mekil about their own law. Because what they're not so concerned that you violate their gzeirah, they're really concerned, their main concern is that you don't violate an Isur Torah. So this is why conceptually you would argue that this is why that's included in the legislation itself, in their original intent. Whereas the Torah, when he gave us a law, the Torah said, don't do this. It meant don't do this. So if you're not sure if doing X is an Aveira or not, you should be, Zahir, you should be Machmir and say, better not to do it. Whereas the Rabbanan said, if you're besafek about a D'Rabbanan, then you can be mekil. We're not as concerned, right? So because the whole, and not just zerot, also for takanot, also for minute, anything like that. And I'll give you another example, right? Another example is brachot, right? So brachot are D'Rabbanan. The only exception is Birkat HaMazon, and according to some poskim, Birkat HaTorah. But let's say when you make a bracha on a mitzvah, the bracha itself is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, right? So going back to Hanukkah. So let's say you lit candles on Leil Hanukkah, and then a few minutes later, you don't remember if you said the bracha or not. And believe me, these things happen. That's all.
No, never to me.
So what's the din? The din is you don't say them. You don't go if you're besafek. You don't say them, right? Safek because the bracha itself is a din d'Rabbanan. So safek d'Rabbanan lekula, and there's also a reason not to do it nishum safek because when you say a bracha, you're saying Shem Hashem, and if there's no chiyuv for you to say Shem Hashem, then you shouldn't say Shem Hashem. That's an Isur D'Oraita, lo tisay Shem Hashem l'shav. So safek brachot lahakel. But if you're not sure if you lit candles or not, well, actually, I should lighting candles. Let's leave that aside, because the whole ikar of the mitzvah of Hanukkah is d'Rabbanan. But let's say if you're not sure if you shook lulav, then you shake lulav. But I'll smach that maybe you did shake lulav and you just forgot. So when you go to shake lulav mishum safek, you don't say the bracha. Right? So the mitzvah d'oraisa is to shake lulav, but the mitzvah d'Rabbanan is to say the bracha. So that's applicable here, and it's an important general rule that we're mekil for the Rabbanan, and we're machmir d'oraita, and that's the basic. That's I think the basic approach to understand it. I have to stop now, and this is actually a good place to stop. Anyway, because whatever. I'm getting ready to come back to Israel, God willing, tomorrow morning. So I have something else to do. Anyway, I'm sorry for my excuses. Have a good Shabbos. God willing, I'll be in touch after the Chag, if not before, but we'll have Shir after the Chag. And everybody have a Chag Sameach v'Kasher.
Chag Sameach, Nesia Tova.
Thank you. I'll see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.